When I think of the NES, I think of games like Super Mario Bros., Legend of Zelda 2, and Kirby's Dream Land. So never in my life would I have thought that Gimmick was the best game of them all, that is, until I found it. My initial discovery of Gimmick was brought about by the finding of this game's music online, which in my opinion was comparable to the quality of games like Plock, which is to say very good. Of course, this is no standalone feat. In combination with Masahi Kageyama's great composition, an effort to replicate the feeling of a live performance, and the Sunsoft audio chip inside of the cartridge, it's no wonder that Gimmick's soundtrack is incomparable to games of its platform. However, it would be ignorant to dismiss the game's late release of 1992, which of course contributes in part to the game's quality versus other titles from the platform. This is all just briefing though, so I'll get onto the actual game. The game starts with a cutscene that outlines a story in which a girl is mistakenly gifted a toy, which was actually a creature named Yumotaro, which is the player. The toy mistakenly transports the girl to another dimension, and it's your goal to save her. Gimmick's uniqueness is attributed in fact to its exuberant game design. Games of this time are often very linear, and for example, had you going from point A to B, usually dealing with some sort of obstacle or enemy. While Gimmick isn't the same in regards of the style of game design, the mechanics and other parts of its game design elevate it like no other of its platform. Yumotaro is able to summon a star exhibiting physical properties. It interacts with the player's velocity, and Yumotaro is able to stand on it. It's up to you as the player to make good use of this ability to gain an advantage throughout every stage, and you'll definitely need every advantage as this game is no cakewalk. This is in part due to the game's development history, which is even more interesting considering that the game's programmer, Tanomi Sakai, considered that the addition of a continue option that made it into the final game detrimented the raw difficulty of the game, and because of such addition, he went as so far as to make the real final boss of the game be locked behind a whole playthrough of the game with no continues and making sure you collect all the secret items. He did this because he thought that once the player had become acquainted with Yumotaro's mechanics and whatnot, the game would become familiar to them. Of course, while this can be said with any game, he had become too good at his own game, and attributing to the fact that his peers could also go through the game no problem, his opinion on the difficulty of Gimmick was supported. This is something I can personally attest to as well as a game developer with my playtesters. Often I think that certain decisions made in my game design with my projects are good enough, but sometimes those decisions come out as making my games too easy or difficult. This is why I think it's imperative to have people from all types of different gaming backgrounds, from knowing nothing to knowing it all. This is not to say that Gimmick is a flawed game in terms of difficulty. I've definitely had my fair share of difficult experiences in gaming, from Terraria's Master Mode to Cave Story's Hard Mode, but all of these games definitely made me take a break at some point, which is not a bad thing. I used to have some rage back then, but for example, with Cave Story's Hard Mode, I beat it in 10 months without raging, and I can say I felt pretty accomplished after that. I do like difficult experiences, and even though on my playthrough I didn't get to the true final boss of Gimmick, I think that I will when I decide to play it again and start grinding my way to beat the game fully next time. However, it would be ignorant to dismiss the game's excellent game design shown in the enemies. Rather than making each enemy hostile against the player, each enemy has a behavior like an ecosystem. For example, the black enemies throughout the game are mostly hostile with the exception of one being able to be controlled by the second player in the second stage, and on later stages, some enemies are just minding their own business. In combination with the gameplay, it makes what would feel like a linear and predictable game feel like walking through an environment with real intelligence. Extending on the point of Gimmick's late development, the game's visuals allude to the fact of the high developmental knowledge of the NES. In my opinion, these are some of the best NES graphics I've ever seen. If you cropped a portion of the screen at specific parts and told me it was a SNES game, you may fool me. Touching on Gimmick's graphics and music though, while the original game was really good, I failed to see anyone mention or talk about the Exa Arcadia Gimmick Exactmix version at all. For those who don't know, around 2020, Exa Arcadia released a port of Gimmick exclusively for arcades that featured remixed music, redone graphics, and extra visuals that make it an amazing version and way to play Gimmick. Unfortunately, it's an arcade exclusive version, meaning that if you want to play it, you either need to buy the arcade cabinet yourself for around 1,200 USD, or find an arcade with the cabinet, both of which are very hard to do. And in combination with Gimmick's call audience, as of current, attempts to archive the game's ROM and emulate it are very unlikely. I saw a comment somewhere that someone tried to do it, but got sued by EXA and had to shut down the project. In the end, this is all for financial motivation, as EXA is an arcade company and wants to make as much money as possible. I myself don't really see the arcade industry, specifically in relation to games, being as available in a few decades, so maybe when EXA realizes that there's no more money to be had there, we may see an official port of that version to modern systems. And yes, I am aware that there is a port of the original NES version for Switch and Steam, but it's not as special as the EXA version. A final thing I wanted to say, a lot of people point similarities between Gimmick and Kirby, but ironically, Gimmick was released before Kirby, and I actually thought that it looked a lot more like Bubble Bobble. And before ending this video, I'd like to give credit to the video The Untold Story of Mr. Gimmick by Hayden Loves Anime, as a good portion of what I'm saying is cited from that video, which I recommend you to watch. I'll link it in the description for those interested.